Bill Galston, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Yascha.
Bill, so yesterday we saw that a jury in Manhattan found Donald Trump guilty on all counts. The first time that a US president was found to be criminally guilty. This seems like a major moment, but there have been major moments in the past that have turned out not to be quite what they seemed. How much do you think this is going to transform the presidential campaign and the fate of Donald Trump?
Well, I will go out on a limb and suggest that in the context of everything else, this event is likely to have only limited significance and impact, and it may well be washed away by the results of the upcoming presidential debate on June 27th, which I regard as potentially a much more transformative event than the outcome of this trial.
So there's some hope, obviously, that people have that, a lot of independents, perhaps a lot of low information voters who haven't really tuned into the political debate that much, will look at this verdict and say, 12 Americans, jury of his peers, have decided he's guilty. That somehow transforms things. On the other side, of course, there is the fact that people have known Donald Trump for a very long time, and most Americans seem to have made the way up about him one way or the other. And the fact that he had an affair with a porn star and has paid her off for her silence doesn't exactly break with the image that most people have with Donald Trump. You don't think that this is going to sway voters in the way that a lot of people on MSNBC and CNN are hoping these days?
No, I don't. But there's one thing I want to emphasize. I'm not sure. And anybody who says that he or she is or is sure about what the impact is going to be is exceeding a reasonable evidentiary brief. And I say this, this is some combination of humility and self-protection. That is, 15 years ago, I thought I understood the American electorate pretty well. I have lost that confidence. I remember in August of 2015, I was watching, the very first Republican debate with a veteran political reporter, someone who's seen many more people up close than I have. And we turned to each other after a comment that Trump made and said, "That's it. He's finished. He can't possibly go on." And of course he did. And I've had that reaction over and over and over again, and I've been wrong every single time. And what that has told me is that that I don't understand a large portion of the American electorate very well at all. And I've tried to educate myself, but I have no confidence that I've educated myself enough, to be able to predict public reactions anymore. And, it's easy to be glib and say, well, such and such has already been factored into the public's view of Donald Trump, or it hasn't. Who the hell knows? It's not a rhetorical question. Well, it is, but it isn't. Maybe somebody knows, but I don't. And so, I can try.
If somebody knows, we don't know who it is who knows, so it's not very much help.
And we won't be able to tell how it is that they know what they actually do know.
And the obvious point here is that polling is pretty helpful, past patterns in polling are pretty helpful when there is a clear precedent, right? What happens to the popularity of an incumbent president when there's a sudden rise in unemployment in the 6 months leading up to the elections? We have a lot of past evidentiary base to go on that. So even though the fate of each particular president might, for various reasons, defy the expectations, we have a pretty good sense of what that does. There is no past evidentiary polling base on what happens to the popularity of a former president who's just been convicted, of a felony crime in a somewhat complicated set of legal circumstances. Taking a step back a little bit from the electoral consequences, where does this leave the United States and its democratic system? I think there's something kind of extraordinary here, where a major presidential candidate is now criminally convicted by a jury of his peers under circumstances that is somewhat complicated because, the prosecutor is an elected prosecutor who had promised to prosecute Donald Trump in one of the most democratic-leaning jurisdictions in the country under a rather novel legal theory. Half of the country is tuned out. A quarter of the country thinks this is finally justice coming to somebody who, and I share that part of the judgment, has done many, many bad things in office and out of office. And about a quarter of the population thinks that this is a politically motivated persecution rather than prosecution, which is, trying to stop a popular politician from being able to present themselves to the public. And of course, there's a prospect of various legal instances having to weigh in on this case in the coming weeks, which may further politicize our judiciary. Where does that leave us in terms of our democratic institutions?
It can't be helpful. We have gone through a long process of delegitimizing our institutions one by one and then collectively. And, we're now going to go through at least 5 months, if not more, of Republican vilification of the judicial system. A kangaroo court, witch hunt. I mean, we already know all of the epithets that are going to be hurled. We also know that Mr. Trump and his supporters are very good at homing in on a single punchy message and repeating it over and over and over again until it is widely believed by all of those who are disposed to believe such things. And I don't see how this can be good news for the judiciary in the United States or for our political institutions generally. And on the other hand, trust in institutions has declined so far in recent decades that in many cases it's at rock bottom. Judiciary has been somewhat exempt from this process until recently, but led by the Supreme Court, public confidence in our judicial system has been declining as well. So, will this be transformative? I don't think so, for the simple reason that attitudes towards our political institutions have already been transformed very substantially. This will add to the pressure, but I don't think it will fundamentally change the low trust morass in which we're all mired as a country.
Walk us through what will actually happen now. The sentencing has been scheduled for July. Donald Trump
July
will
11th,
clearly...
to be precise, 4 days before the beginning of the Republican convention, which will be interesting.
So what happens? So there's some question about whether he will be given a custodial sentence or not. But assuming that he would be, presumably the Republican convention is not going to change its mind, and there's very strong rules to stop any delegates from changing their minds in any case. But assuming that Donald Trump is actually given a custodial sentence, what on earth happens next?
Well, I do not regard it as likely that the sentence will go into effect between now and the presidential election. uh, there will be, and even if a sentence is imposed, there will be an immediate appeal. I don't believe that any judge, including, the judge in this case, would impose a sentence that would make it impossible for Donald Trump to campaign for president between now and November. And I think it would be a huge mistake, to impose such a sentence, because that would simply add fuel to the charge that this is a politically motivated effort to get Mr. Trump out of the way. I don't take that prospect very seriously. I think a sentence will be imposed. There will be an immediate appeal. The execution of the sentence will be stayed pending the appeal, and we'll only know after the election. Now, if, as most people now know, whatever happens in the other trials, if Mr. Trump does return to the Oval Office, he does not have the constitutional power to pardon himself for state crimes, only for federal crimes. And so there is the prospect, if he returns to the Oval Office, that after the appeals process is exhausted, that he could find himself on the receiving end of an executed sentence while he's sitting in the Oval Office. But that's some way down the road.
It is down the road, and it depends on a number of significant ifs. Would he just have to avoid setting foot in the state of New York? Would the state of New York request for the judicial system to arrest Donald Trump, and the Secret Service would protect him against such arrest? I mean, what on earth would that mean for the kind of, already if Donald Trump becomes president again, we can expect significant chaos. But if Donald Trump becomes president under a circumstance in which there is, a legally valid sentence handed down against him that requires him to start serving jail in the state of New York while he's sitting in the White House in Washington, D.C., and presumably not minded to comply with that order, it would just add another level of, with excuses for using the stereotype, a banana republic level chaos to the American democratic system. How would this play out?
Uh, the phrase uncharted waters hardly does justice to that hypothetical, Yascha. I don't know how it would play out. I mean, it's interesting to contemplate, and one interesting, one amusing hypothetical that I've heard is that he would receive probation plus an order to perform community service. Now, it would be wonderful to find out what President Trump's understanding of community service would be in those circumstances. The mind reels. He would no doubt argue that deporting 15 million illegal evidence is the greatest service that anybody on the face of the earth could render to the American Republic. Look, the mind reels.
Well, these are dark and troubled times. But the image of Donald Trump performing community service, perhaps somewhere in the Bronx, which he's become acquainted with in the last weeks, picking up trash on the side of some road, is cheering me a little bit, with all the Secret Service surrounding him as he picks up one piece of trash in a theatrical manner. Perhaps we can close the preamble to the rest of our conversation in this way. Where do you think we are with the state of the US election? The polls seem to be reasonably close at the moment, perhaps giving Donald Trump a little bit of an edge. Who do you think will win come November?
The United States, for quite some time now, has been locked, into a pattern of very close elections at the national level. Not at the state level or the local level necessarily, but at the national level, when you add it all up, it's about even. And it does not appear to me that this election is going to be a deviation from the trend of recent elections. And what that means is that there is no responsible way at this point of forecasting the outcome of the election. And I say that not to duck your question, but because I can think of a dozen events that might occur between now and the first week of November that could alter the balance. I will say that if the election were held tomorrow, I believe Donald Trump would win it. So analytically, the right question is what can change between now and the first week of November that would improve Joe Biden's position? And it is, I think, an imponderable whether an actual criminal conviction would move for Mr. Trump, would move the dial sufficiently to achieve that outcome. I've been doing a very close analysis of the 7 swing states, as your listeners, I'm sure, know. Most of the states have strong majorities for one party or another, leaving a maximum of 7 states, 3 in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, 3 in the south and border, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and possibly North Carolina, although I'm a skeptic about the Democrats' chances in North Carolina. And right now, Donald Trump is leading in all but one of those swing states by, I wouldn't say hefty margins, but measurable margins that are sufficient to suggest that he really is in the lead. And those states have different characteristics. The Midwestern states are dense with voters who do not have a 4-year college education. They have a distinctive profile that, on balance, Donald Trump has done very well with. The issue in Arizona and to some extent Nevada as well is immigration. Not the issue, but it is bulks larger than in other places. Georgia, I think, is shaping up as more of a straight economics election. I could go on, but suffice it to say that right now the 2 issues most on the minds of voters, namely the state of the economy and immigration, are issues that cut in favor of Donald Trump. Issues like abortion and the fight for American democracy cut against Donald Trump, but they appear to be lower down on voters' lists of priorities, or at least many of them. And so the terrain of battle is not favorable for Joe Biden right now. On the other hand, as I said, I can think of many, many things that could change the outcome. And regrettably, even though the election is poised on a knife's edge, the consequences for Europe and the world could be outsized, depending on 1 or 2% of the vote in the United States. If I were a European, I would be nervous.
I'm both a European and an American, and I'm nervous as a European and I'm nervous as an American. So,
right.
Doubly nervous. Why do you think the election is so close? And in that sense, the sense in which I'm asking this question is an analytical disagreement that smart observers of American politics currently have, I think. Right. So when you imagine a country in which, 3 consecutive elections, a very, very close run with high degrees of polarization, where people who are strong partisans of one party really hate strong partisans of the other party. And each time it comes down to a few thousand votes here or there. What you might imagine is a country with a very clear ethnic, religious, or tribal cleavage, right? Where you have Catholics on one side and Protestants on the other, or Christians on one side and Muslims on the other, or people from one ethnic group on the one side and one ethnic group on the other side. And from election to election, the outcome hinges mostly on mobilization. It mostly hinges on who has turned out to the polls, or perhaps who happens to have had a little bit more population growth over the course of the last 4 or 8 years. Right? The other kind of image, though, is that the United States doesn't really fit that. That even for those clear demographic patterns to who votes for Democrats, who votes for Republicans, A huge number of white people vote for the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. A huge number of non-white people vote for the Republican Party rather than the Democratic Party. And in fact, when you look at some of those demographic crosstabs, there's been significant change from 2016 to the current polls. White people are much more likely now to vote for the Democratic Party than they were in 2016, and non-white people, especially Hispanics, but not just Hispanics, are much more likely to vote for the Republican Party when they were in 2016. So I have, I guess, a two-part question. One is, to what extent do you buy that second description of the situation? And if that is true, then why are elections always so damn close? Because in the first case, it's easy to know why they're close. There's two demographic blocks. Demographic blocks don't shift very easily. And so each time it's just a question of mobilization. If they happen to have a similar population size, the election is always going to be close. On the second image, it looks like there's actually a lot of persuasion going on. A lot of people are changing their mind. People who voted for Trump in 2016 are now voting for Biden. People who voted for Hillary in 2016 are now going to vote for Trump. But if that's the case, why are those voter flows so similar in size to each other that even though the composition of the tribes keeps changing, it so happens that we end up with similarly close run elections?
Well, first of all, I think the focus on ethnicity, which made sense in many past elections, is getting less significant now. Or to put it very simply, the issue of class is rising in importance, and the issue of ethnicity is declining in importance. And the fundamental marker of class in the United States, but not only in the United States, is education. And you have this phenomenon across the industrialized West where the working classes are shifting to the right, and educated people are shifting not sharply to the left, but they feel more comfortable in parties that endorse multi-ethnic diversity and that focus on issues other than bread and butter issues. The professional middle classes are not worried about their daily bread as much as the working class is, for good reason, by the way, and therefore can afford to focus on issues such as abortion, such as climate change, and yes, such as the fate of democracy as they understand that fate. And so what you have in the picture you just described, the fluid picture, and it is a fluid picture, is it's not all Hispanics that are shifting in the direction of the Republican Party. It's principally working class Hispanics with less than a college education. And similarly, it appears for other groups and among whites. For sure, you have lines that have been going like this. If you look at the past 30 years, in the early 1990s, Republicans, commanded the vote of whites with a college education. Now it's the Democrats who do. And during that period, Bill Clinton ran just about even among working class voters with the two Republicans he faced. And now Donald Trump commands them, by a 2-to-1 margin. So yes, the elections have remained close because it happens that in this fluid picture, about as many college-educated people have shifted towards the Democrats as working class people have shifted towards the Republicans. And until that symmetrical shift is upended by demographics of one sort or another, or unless one party or another figures out how to appeal across class lines, which has become more and more difficult in American politics, I think our elections will continue to be close.
Let's dive a little bit into this question of what Thomas Piketty has called the Brahmanization of the left, right? The fact that the left used to be the organized political force mostly of working class people, of poorer people, of less educated people, and not just in the United States, but in most European countries as well. It has now become the political force of the highly educated. And since we live in an economy that highly prizes education, also of the affluent, of social and cultural elites. that is a remarkable transformation. And I guess I wonder how that happened and whether it's your fault, Bill. And I'll tell you why, even though you are.
I know where you're going, yeah.
Because you are a critic of these developments. I think you're one of the voices that rightly lambasts the Democratic Party for the ways in which they are giving up on the working class. But you were, of course, one of the intellectual progenitors of the Third Way and of Bill Clinton's ascent in the United States. You were an important advisor to Bill Clinton. And I wonder, and I've put a version of this question before to people like Tony Blair and David Miliband on this podcast, so you're in good company. But I wonder whether Bill Clinton in the United States and New Labour in Britain sort of free-rided on the unthinking working class commitment to the left in a certain generation of people, and therefore build a political project that was probably the right way to build majorities for doing things that I think broadly were right in the 1990s and early 2000s, but ended up in ways that nobody foresaw and perhaps could foresee at that time, being part of that key transition, right? So one way of describing the electoral strategy of Bill Clinton, of Tony Blair, is to say, look, we already have a lot of working class voters. We need to do better among the middle class. And we're going to do better among the middle class through a mixture of economic moderation, social liberalization relative to some of the laws and customs that were on the books then, certainly sort of fighting with a particular kind of conservative vision of what society should be like, but without any kind of cultural radicalism. We distance ourselves from any form of cultural radicalism. That succeeded in attracting the middle classes to those political parties, but perhaps it succeeded too well, because those parties then came to dominate, certainly, or those classes then came to dominate, certainly in the party apparatus, and slowly, as the kind of sociological backing for the left link with the working class gave away, as unions declined, as the kinds of economic battles of the post-Cold War era declined, of the post-war era declined, those people became alienated. They became alienated because they no longer saw the Democrats or Labour as the only party fighting for their economic interests, and because they increasingly thought that the cultural mores of those middle and upper middle class voters that were now in the left column were very different from how they see the world and what they preferred. Is that a fair picture? And what lessons does it hold if it is?
Well, first of all, I can't answer for Tony Blair or David Miliband, both of whom I respect very much as leaders. But I can't answer for myself. And I'll begin where everyone who charges me with these crimes, political crimes, begins, and that is with the famous New Democratic Manifesto that I published in 1989 with my co-author Elaine Kmark. And far from an argument for abandoning the working classes, even by implication, it was an argument for reconnecting with them. The background, the background was the election of 1988, where the middle fell out for Michael Dukakis and the Democrats. The Democrats at that point scored well with, upper income professionals and with downtrodden minority groups, but very poorly in the middle. And our argument, if you go back and take a look at that document, is that we needed to reconnect with the interests and values, as we put it, of people struggling to get into the middle class and people struggling to stay in the middle class. And so far from recommending a move towards cultural progressivism, we recommended a move towards cultural moderation. Uh, and if you look at the signature social policies of the Clinton administration, they involve, first of all, an anti-crime bill, which is now being denounced by the left as a source of mass incarceration, et cetera. I'm not going to go into that particular issue. I think that charge is also false, but let's leave that aside for now. And secondly was welfare reform, which redeemed the promise that Bill Clinton made during his campaign to end welfare as we now know it. And as a result, I think of those two measures plus an economy that was working for everyone. If you go back and take a look at the statistics, working class incomes, the incomes of African Americans and Hispanics were expanding as rapidly as professional and upper class incomes during that period. You will find that Bill Clinton was reelected in 1996 with a substantially larger margin than he got in 1992, and that he left office with a 66% approval rating, which is astronomical by current standards. The record will also show that Bill Clinton, for a Democrat, did very well with working class voters, especially in his reelection campaign. I should also say that the hegira of working class voters from the Democratic Party started in the late 1960s because working class voters were outraged in particular by two things: the counterculture and by the apparent lack of patriotism of the Vietnam protesters. And so Nixon did well with working class voters in 1968, and he did extraordinarily well with working class voters against George McGovern in 1972. So the new Democratic Party, as Elaine and I understood it, represented a concerted effort to get back in touch with working class and lower middle class voters, and if I may say so, a reasonably successful one. So I guess my argument is that the real shifts began early in the 21st century rather than at the end of the 20th, and part of that had to do with the rise of the environmental movement, which Al Gore represented and which many working class voters saw as a threat to their livelihoods, with some justification, by the way, and then exacerbated by shifts in the direction of cultural progressivism that occurred in the second decade of the 21st century, generating the situation that we now find ourselves in. Let me complexify this one more time. We all, across party lines, made a huge mistake right at the beginning of the 21st century when we allowed China to enter the World Trade Organization on concessional terms. That was a united project of the leaders of both political parties, and it was a catastrophe. In the first decade of the 21st century, the United States lost 5.3 million manufacturing jobs, about a third of its manufacturing base, 30% to be precise. And that set in motion a chain of events that led us to where we now are.
So that's an interesting way of shifting the story a little bit about where it comes from. I'm reflecting on whether there's subtle differences in the British trajectory and the American trajectory. It probably was true in Britain as well that in the 1980s, when the Labour Party had its years in the wilderness, it probably did well among certain sections of upper class professionals, as well as retaining a sort of traditional loyalty among mining communities and other kinds of working class constituencies. I wonder whether the nature of the shift in appeal to the middle class was parallel to what you're saying or not. Certainly, one of the famous lines from New Labour's campaign, for example, is tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. So this certainly wasn't the Brahmin left of today. It wasn't faculty lounge politics, as James Carville would call it. Um, uh, but I wonder whether the kind of cultural, perhaps there's something less direct here, where the problem is not the particular policies that either New Labour or the Democrats pursued, but the sort of sociological shift in milieu that resulted from it. Right? Suddenly, it was the dominant party at universities in a way it hadn't been in the past. And then when universities subsequently shifted in the 2000s and 2010s in terms of what was expected of somebody to believe or to profess to believe in order to be in good standing, that is what did that damage. So there may be a kind of more subtle story here. The question I have, though, goes a little bit beyond that, which is what would Democrats in the United States or other political parties in Europe and elsewhere have to do to recapture the working class and in its broadest definition, which is to say the poorer voters who are not now voting for these parties, but also the kind of aspirational middle class that really was the target of Bill Clinton and which you recommended in your manifesto Democrats should go after?
Well, the issues terrain has shifted to some extent. And I don't have a simple answer to your question, but I do have a suggestion as to where to begin. 2 points. Number one, I think people who are accustomed, and I mean this analytically, to a kind of quasi-Marxist framework for analysis, namely that the economy is the base and the rest is superstructure, I think are going to have to adjust to the fact that we now live in an era in which cultural issues may be as basic as economic issues are in determining political behavior. And now let me get specific. I cannot think of an issue that has been more harmful to the left than its inability to get its arms around the immigration issue in the United States and Europe, opening the door for huge political gains on the right. And so recommendation number one would be to converge, as Europe finally, as I understand it, is beginning to, on an answer to that question. In that respect, I think Europe is now ahead of the United States, where we're still clashing. And you have advocates on the left who see the issue principally in humanitarian terms. You have advocates on the right who see it principally in cultural terms. And then you have people in the middle who are viewing it, I think, as principally an economic issue, who have the better side of the argument, but who cannot get together across party lines to forge the kind of comprehensive and balanced agreements that are necessary. Having said that, if you'll permit me, since I'm now an old man, another dive into history. The United States in the first 2 decades of the 21st century had numerous opportunities to enact the kind of legislation that we desperately needed now or then in 2006, 2007, and then again, most fatefully in 2013, where a famous bipartisan Gang of Eight in the Senate of the United States put together a comprehensive immigration reform that passed the Senate, with 68 votes, 68 votes. And then it got to the House of Representatives. It commanded a clear majority in the House, but because it did not command a majority among the Republican caucus, which was then in the majority, Speaker of the House, John Boehner, in an act that I am afraid will be or should be on his tombstone, refused to bring the bill to the floor of the House because he thought he would lose the support of his own party caucus. And with that refusal went, unfortunately, the last serious effort to ward off the now virtually unlimited all weapons allowed debate over immigration that has disfigured American politics and continues to. Immigration was the most important issue in Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. According to the best political analysts I know, it was the issue that pushed him over the top, and it could be the issue that pushes him over the top 8 years later in the forthcoming election. So that would be a start on the cultural front, and I actually think that that the Democratic Party in the United States under Joe Biden has begun to rebalance its economic strategy. It's more comfortable with government intervention into the economy than, say, Bill Clinton was, and also more necessary, I would say. It is more comfortable with trade restrictions, with looking at trade on a bilateral as well as a multilateral basis, more comfortable with tariffs, etc. In other words, there has been a shift towards economic nationalism, which has narrowed the gap between the two major parties in the United States, interestingly enough, which is one reason why a lot of bipartisan economic legislation actually passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, because he was no longer making a neoliberal argument.
Do you think that we will get to a genuine political realignment sometime after Joe Biden and Donald Trump are off the stage? And what would that realignment look like, or rather, what are the different kinds of scenarios for it? The one that you describe is one in which Democrats move somewhat to the left on the economy, certainly become more comfortable with a bigger government role in the economy, become more active in making sure that working people actually profit from economic activity and economic growth, but in which they clearly moderate on cultural terms. And we haven't hit the particulars in a lot of detail here beyond immigration, but I imagine that part of that would be to divorce themselves from the cultural politics of the highly educated American elite and the form of identity politics that has now become de rigueur within it. I think that opening is absolutely there, and that a Democrat who stands for that in a clear and unabashed way would do very well. I worry, though, that there's a lot of structural constraints to Democrats getting there. One of which is the continuing cowardice of a great number of people who live and operate in that world to actually express their genuine opinions. I saw one piece of evidence of that recently, an anonymous faculty poll at a major American university, which requires for many of its candidates to do mandatory DEI statements. And in this anonymous poll, faculty members were asked how they feel about these mandatory statements from job applicants for faculty positions. A huge majority said that they think that this is an ideological litmus test that should be absolutely unacceptable in the application process. And yet this university and many, if not most universities, now require exactly those kind of mandatory DEI statements. What faculty members, including many who are tenured at some of the leading universities in the world, will be willing to say to their colleagues is different from what they actually think. And that, I think, will make it very hard, not just for the leadership of the Democratic Party, but also for the broader set of institutions with which the Democrats are now so associated that voters judge them on that, to sort of disown this set of highly unpopular attitudes. So the question is whether there is a potential for a realignment on the other end, whether the attempts by some Republican candidates and by some Republican office holders, by some Republican intellectuals, to turn themselves into a kind of multiracial working class party can succeed. Now, obviously, the obstacles are also very large, including the fact that there is a part of the Republican base that doesn't want to be part of a working class multiracial coalition. And there certainly are big differences in economic interests and in cultural outlook between many of the traditional Republican voters and the ones that those elements within the party want to expand to. But it seems to me that these are the two kinds of ways, these are the two kinds of obvious ways in which realignment might happen. You can sort of, when you squint very hard, see a path towards either one, but there also seem to be significant structural obstacles in both cases, such that we could continue sort of bumbling through the slightly incoherent form of politics we currently have, in which the incompetence of one party in terms of its electoral strategy is masked by the incompetence of the other political party in terms of its electoral strategy, and so nobody has to course correct because two parties that are going off course are somehow in equilibrium. So, do you think we're going to get an electoral realignment? If so, when might that happen? And in particular, which form would it most likely take? Or are there third and fourth scenarios that you think are perhaps more likely than the two I've outlined?
I don't know whether we're going to get a political realignment in the classic sense. What I do know is that suppressed arguments are going to break out in both political parties after the conclusion of this election. Why do I think that? Simple. Unless one candidate or another chooses to disregard the Constitution, whichever one takes power in January of 2025 will be limited to a single term, that term. Joe Biden could not succeed himself. Donald Trump could not succeed himself. And both, to put it bluntly, are or will be octogenarians. There will be a long suppressed debate in the Democratic Party, which Joe Biden had succeeded in muting with his unity strategy, which was pursued very intentionally from the moment he got the nomination in the late spring of 2020. That unity strategy masks a host of ongoing disagreements within the party, which I think will burst out into the open. And similarly, if Donald Trump takes power, he will do his best to suppress the debate in the Republican Party about his policies. But I can tell you this for sure: the ambitions of the young, will be an effective counter to the dominance of the old. And Donald Trump may want to restrain debate, but particularly after the first 2 years in his administration, ambitious younger people will be making arguments of their own about the way forward. A fortiori, as we academics say, if Donald Trump loses for the second consecutive time, there will be a really fundamental debate within the Republican Party about the path that he has led them down, because many Republicans are hungry for a party that can not only win close elections, but also can build governing majorities, which right now neither political party has, and they both know it. They both want it. And so it's an unstable situation. Neither political party is satisfied with the share of support in the electorate that it now has, and for good and sufficient reason. So both are strongly motivated to open up the debates that have been suppressed. I do not think, to come to particulars, that the Republicans are going to abandon the more nationalist, culturally conservative, working class friendly approach that they are now taking, because they are not convinced that the possible gains from that strategy have yet been fully realized, and with good reason. Right? If they are really serious, as you put it, about building a multi-ethnic working class party, they still have a long way to go. The progress with Hispanics has been measurable but limited up to this point, and with African Americans virtually non-existent. So there are votes to be harvested in that path if they can make it consistent. But they face the kind of obstacle that you pointed out. I do think, by the way, that the shift among Democrats that you talked about to somewhat to the pro-government left on economic policy, but the working class, middle class center on cultural issues does represent the path of the future. Biden has executed one of those two strategies, but not regrettably the other. As a matter of fact, he's allowed himself to become the pawn, I think, of the cultural left more often than has been good for him. He stood up on defund the police, and I think it helped him win the 2020 election. Or to put it more simply, I think if he'd gone along with that, he would have lost the 2020 election. But on other issues, particularly immigration, he has found himself unable to resolve or unwilling to resolve the debate within the party.
Reince Priebus, famously the then chairman of the RNC, the Republican National Committee, famously put together a report after Obama's second victory in 2012, in which he said that the Republican Party needed to moderate in order to win over more non-white voters and become nationally competitive. Donald Trump's rise and nomination in 2016 was widely seen at the time as repudiating that strategy, as doubling down on a declining white base. And there are some political scientists who continue to view Trump in that light, saying he is trying to sort of extend as long as possible the rule of a declining minority and therefore needs to undermine democratic institutions. It seems to me that there's a different way of looking at that and of telling that story, in which Trump actually executed precisely that strategy, in which he actually did broaden the Republican coalition by appealing more greatly to those demographic groups, just by a very different political path than Reince Priebus suggested, that the path towards growing support in those groups was not, in fact, cultural moderation. It was a cultural polarization that started to lambast where the Democratic establishment stood on those issues, helped by the fact that the Democratic establishment from 2013 to today moved far to the left on many of those ideas. Do you think that's a fair way of interpreting sort of the nature of Trump's political coalition? And if so, do you think there was anything conscious about it? Or did Trump, who does seem to get lucky in his life in all kinds of ways, just sort of stumbled into it without really being aware of the fact that that might possibly be the outcome of his political positioning and political appeal?
I have a somewhat different view, and that is that, despite charges that, Trump is purely situational and purely transactional, he actually has a small body of ideas to which he's, clung since the 1980s, having to do with, trade, immigration, globalization, and the role of America in the world. And he brought those ideas with him in his challenge, in his successful challenge to the Republican establishment in 2016. At the same time, he made his peace very intelligently with the existing body of, with the existing blocks within the traditional Republican Party. It was remarkably systematic when you think about it. He went to the evangelical community and said, "What do you care about the most?" And they said judges. He gave them the judges they wanted. He went to the big business community and said, "What do you care about the most?" And they said tax cuts. He gave them tax cuts. He went to the small business community and said, "What's hurting you the most?" And they said, "This over-regulation. We simply can't deal with it the way big business can." So he gave them a very well-organized deregulatory campaign. And so the deal was that the traditional wing of the Republican Party got what it wanted most, and in return, he got the opportunity to exercise his policies in the areas where he had developed views. And that's more or less what happened during his first term. But there was something else going on that I think is very important, in looking at his relationship to the famous autopsy of Reince Priebus. And that is that Trump figured out two things about, let's look at Hispanics. He figured out, number one, that what they cared about the most was the economy, not immigration. And if you look at what happened to their incomes during the first 3 years of the Trump administration before the pandemic hit, they went up considerably. And so if you ask Hispanics, did they do better in the first 3 years of Trump or the first 3 years of Biden? They will overwhelmingly say in the first 3 years of Trump. Secondly, Trump figured out, and whether he actually did this consciously or somewhere in the reptilian level of his brain, he figured out that for Hispanics who've been here for 2 or 3 generations and are making their way up the ladder, these immigrants coming across the border without benefit of law represented a threat, a status threat. And so I mean, I will spare you the famous cab driver stories that American political pundits dine off, but I've had this experience myself, where cab drivers will say, well, my wife and I got here the right way, the legal way, and we have worked hard to make a place for ourselves and our families in America. And now this just happened to me yesterday on the road to the airport, which is why it's so fresh in my mind. And now we have these migrants coming to our city, Chicago, and they are getting all of these social supports. They're being given housing for 2 years, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't get any of that. We're here legally. They're not. Why are they getting all of these expensive benefits? And so the people on the social conservative right have figured out something very important about legal immigrants, and that is they don't like illegal immigrants. And they've used it to their advantage.
And one of the bizarre things I always find in this debate is that in a political discourse that is so obsessed with race and so obsessed with identity, Americans are often entirely incapable of perceiving racial differences or identity differences within a group that they describe as minority or people of color or BIPOC or whatever the term today might be. And when you look at the politics of Latin America, it itself is very ethnically polarized. And so to assume that an immigrant from Mexico whose parents or grandparents came to the United States, who has some amount of mixed heritage, but significantly European heritage, that has spoken Spanish in the family for many generations, should somehow think of, an indigenous person from El Salvador, from Guatemala, who within that political system is organizing often in opposition to the more European origin segments of a population who may not even speak Spanish at home, but rather one of the indigenous languages. The fact that they should, that this voter should look at that immigrant and say, we are naturally the same category because in the eyes of American pollsters, we're both Latino, is just, a vast oversimplification of the world. So there shouldn't be something that's surprising that they may not be fully in solidarity with them. One statistic that I think I've cited before in the podcast is that there was around 2016 a clear majority of a population in favor of building a wall on the southern border of Mexico among Mexican voters. And so we shouldn't be entirely surprised by this.
Well, let me just say to that point, Yascha, that I think that our census categories have become obstacles to sociological clarity, and we take them as somehow reifications of an underlying reality, and for exactly the reason you suggest, we don't often enough or hard enough try to break into the black boxes of census categories and look at what's really going on inside them.
I would love to speak to you about what I know you're working on, which is a new book. You've written many important and successful books, but a new book which is about the role of the darker emotions in politics, if I understand the project right. Why it is that we need to take seriously emotions like nationalism, for example, in order to understand the political imagination and in order to be able to channel them into a positive form of politics, in order to ensure that it isn't the generally dangerous and scary political forces that end up with a monopoly on them. How did you come to think about this project? Why is it that our inability to understand and grapple with these kind of emotions is such an obstacle to more successful democratic politics?
Huh. Where to begin? Uh, this is not the first time that political crisis has stimulated new thinking. As a matter of fact, I think that most new thinking in political philosophy arises out of a sense of crisis. And I gradually arrived at the view that what I'll call liberal naivete about human nature was contributing to our inability, to understand the threat to liberal democracy that was being mounted, in Europe clearly, but elsewhere around the world, and certainly in the United States. That we are constantly blindsided, we liberal Democrats, when emotions and passions such as anger, hatred, humiliation, resentment, fear of various kinds, and what Saint Augustine called the libido dominandi, the urge to dominate others, comes to the fore in politics. We tend to believe that certain things that were central to the past, will not be part of our future. That history in that sense is linear and progressive, and it leads away from the dark passions toward the rule of reason. This has been a dream, I would say, since the Enlightenment. But I think, a more defensible form of liberal democratic thinking and practice takes a very different premise as its point of departure, namely that these things are always going to be present in, as possibilities. And our job as defenders of liberal democracy is to understand what turns these possibilities into actualities, and then do our best to make sure that the circumstances that lead to the eruption and even the reign of the dark passions do not come into being. Let me give you an example. I speak to you as a former, I speak to you as a former German, appealing to your own history. Okay. At the end of World War I, there were different paths that the victorious Allies could have taken. And one path, call it the path of magnanimity, would have been to say that World War I was a catastrophe, to which all contributed in some measure. That yes, there was a losing side, but the most important task was for the concord of Europe to be reestablished on a solid basis. There were people making that argument. But the Treaty of Versailles was anything but that. It was a punitive peace. And leading thinkers such as John Maynard Keynes criticized it as that. And they said that no good would come of this peace, and no good did come of that peace. Why? Well, Hitler played on the sense of national humiliation that the Treaty of Versailles had generated among Germans. Humiliation and resentment are closely tied, and resentment is one of the most powerful dark passions that unscrupulous but ambitious politicians can mobilize. Okay, and so it is really, really important, and this is the lesson I draw from that when looking at the consequences of political action, the implications for the sentiments of those who feel that they're on the losing side for one reason or another are taken into account not when they erupt into a crisis of rejection, but well before that. And so every time I hear a liberal politician say that so-and-so is on the wrong side of history, I won't say I reach for my gun, but I reach for my pen, because that is to say that history has a side. History has a direction. Some things that happened in the past are unthinkable for the present or the future. So, of course, the massacre of Srebrenica was unthinkable in the heart of Europe until it happened, right? And there were many people who could not bring themselves to believe that Vladimir Putin would break the rules of Europe that had been established after World War II. But he did. Why? Because I would argue of accumulating resentments, and whether or not they could have been warded off by different policies is a very difficult question. Accumulated resentments and humiliation, at the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia becoming less than what it was in the days of the Soviet Union, and when Barack Obama dismissed Russia as a, quote, regional power, Vladimir Putin heard those words, and he said, no, we aren't. We have been more than that, and we will be more than that again. We will get back what we lost. And if you look at human history, these cycles, are noticeable. I'm not saying that human history is simply cyclical. I'm not a fan of Polybius or circular. I'm not a fan of the Platonic doctrine of the circularity of human history either. But I am saying that it is not linear. It is anything but that. History doesn't end. History has no side. And it doesn't end, it has no side, because something fundamental does not change, and that is us, right? And if we inspect ourselves honestly, we will see that some of these, some of these dark passions, this sense of resentment, we can all feel it in certain situations, I believe. Where we think we've received less than our due, where, some people have taken advantage of the situation, taken advantage of us, et cetera, in small but telling ways. We can find these seeds in ourselves, and we have to ask ourselves, if we were in less fortunate situations than we are, how would we feel? How would we act? Would we be vulnerable to these, the sorts of appeals to the dark passions that politicians throughout history have always been adept at. I could go on, but that's the general idea.
I'm fully in agreement with you on the points you've made, and I'm very excited for this book. What are the implications for the practice of statesmanship, right? If you're thinking about how you build a polity and sustain a polity that doesn't fall prey to those dark passions, but that is deeply aware of the power that they hold over big parts of the population and potentially, depending on the circumstances, over all of us. What does that mean for how you steer the ship of state? And how is it that a failure of reckoning with the dark passions, the naive belief that those passions are of the past, and in the more enlightened present, most people have grown beyond them and we no longer have to deal with them, has led us astray, and perhaps help to explain why it is that so many democracies are in trouble today.
Well, that's, you posed a series of difficult questions in this conversation, and this is another one of them. But I would say this: let us begin by taking a page from the findings of behavioral economics, to the effect that the pleasure of gain is exceeded by the pain of loss. And when you lose something that you had, the combination, the reaction to that, the sentiments that the loss arouses are extremely powerful and leave you open to the claims of those who say, you've lost something that was rightfully yours, and with my leadership, you will get it back. Okay, so statesmanship in these circumstances, in all circumstances, I would say, requires sensitivity to the sense of loss that large sections of a population may feel for one reason or another. And so wise statesmen will do their best to minimize the concentration of losses. And let me give you an example that I've already mentioned. At the end of the 1990s, we had more than 18 million manufacturing jobs. 10 years later, we had a little bit more than 12 million manufacturing jobs. How did we think the people, who experienced those losses, and more to the point, the communities that experienced those losses, how did we think they were going to feel? I have to say, looking back at the decade when that happened, it is remarkable how little discussion there was of this historic change in the American economy, which happened by historical standards in the twinkling of an eye. Right? Did we think that the people who lost those jobs were simply going to sit still, take their losses, and go work at Walmart for half the previous salaries? We should have known better. But we had committed ourselves really across party lines to a course of action that made that outcome almost inevitable. It was one of the great historic mistakes of American statecraft, and I know why it happened. I know exactly why it happened because I was there. And that is the 1990s convinced us that globalization could be made to work for all the classes in the society, because it was working for all the classes in society. And we assumed that that was a permanent phenomenon. The wind was in our sails. We could get all the efficiency gains, all the price gains from globalization, and at the same time proceed with an economy that all were benefiting from, as they did in the 1990s. And then something big changed. That ended, and, we reaped what we sowed, a bitter crop of resentment that turned out to be eminently mobilizable. So lesson number one for statesmanship: as you consider your policies, try to imagine the possibility of concentrated losses creating resentments and backlash and tailor them accordingly. There is no way that that any policy in a large democracy can make all of the people or all the groups happy all of the time. But a certain awareness of the balance of gains and losses among different parts of the society is required. And if people get the sense that they simply don't matter, they're not visible, they're not being heard, their interests are not being taken into account, the likelihood that the dark passions will be mobilizable by unscrupulous leaders rises astronomically.
Bill, we have, I think, a very similar basic political outlook. I think the way, not just the fact that we're both on the center left, but I think the basic way we think about the world is quite similar. One of the reasons for that might be that we both have a background in political theory. You did your PhD in political theory and taught political theory for a long time before coming into public policy. And it strikes me that is a little underexplored source of American public intellectuals. From people like Fareed Zakaria to people like Andrew Sullivan, to rather stranger phenomena like the Bronze Age pervert. There's a lot of people in American public life who have this background in, a small subfield of political science that doesn't graduate all that many people from PhD programs every year. How do you think political theory has influenced how you do your work as somebody who influences public policy and broader public debates? And what, am I overstate? Am I just more aware of this nexus because I'm sort of in that world, so it strikes me when somebody has this political theory background? Or do you think there's something genuine to that connection between political theory, which can seem like it's very remote from the sort of day-to-day politics, which can seem a little cerebral and a little academic in the pejorative sense, and that yet seems to produce this bewildering set of really interesting figures that then go on to influence American public life?
Well, I have found there are two different kinds of political theorists. Those who think that political theory is about political theory, and those who think that political theory is actually about politics. And I'm in the latter camp. I'm interested in studying books because I'm interested in understanding politics. And I'm interested in understanding politics, first of all, because it is among the most complex of all human endeavors, and therefore worth understanding in its own right. But also because there was always a part of me that wanted to be more directly involved in it. And so I ended up, wandering in and out of 6 presidential campaigns. And finally, after a string of losers, honorable losers, but losers, picked a winner and ended up in the White House for two and a half years. It all seemed to be quite accidental, but looking back on it, it was anything but. And political theory, I think, does give you some perspective on human affairs. If you study the classics, which I did, if you pored over Aristotle's Politics, which I did, for example, you have to become aware of the fact that what we now call liberal democracy is one possible regime type among a panoply of others, and that the others don't go away. The forces that lead to the others don't go away. Those forces may, crest and then subside, but that the form of government that you and I both cherish and fight for is not self-executing or self-defending. It's not invulnerable. As a matter of fact, it's exposed to characteristic difficulties. And if you read some more contemporary thinkers like Tocqueville, for example, you get a sense of what some of those difficulties could be. And the end of Volume 2 of Democracy in America is a compendium of those difficulties. And I think Tocqueville perhaps overstated the matter in some respects, but he has alerted to dangers that are clear, even if they're not always present. And when they're both clear and present, as they are now, we're in trouble. So political theory is connected to the desire to be involved in politics, in my sense, but it's also connected to the perspective that you need in order to be involved in politics in the right way. Right? If you're too theoretical, you are removed from the actual practice of politics. But if you are simply immersed in it, in the day-to-dayness of politics, without some sense of the broader possibilities, but also the broader dangers, then I think you get into trouble. And the countries that are dominated by people like that can get into trouble.
So let me restate this as a question that perhaps a relatively younger listener to this podcast might pose. Somebody who, let's say, is an undergrad and is trying to figure out what next steps to take. If you want to be influential in politics in some kind of way, one path is to study very concrete public policy, right? Become great at running statistical models or doing microeconomics or something like that. Another is to go to the heights of abstraction, to really think about the grand theories of the social world and so on. It sounds like you're suggesting that there's a kind of middle path in which you are thinking about big theoretical questions that allow you to have greater purchase on the world, to develop a more distinctive perspective, to see through the follies of the current consensus of position, which always exists and which is always full of shortcomings, but in a way that's still practical, but still is able to actually connect to the real world. What does that look like? I mean, if that's the kind of education you seek, if that's the kind of reflection, that's the kind of course of reflection you want to engage in to develop your own, particular political position and perspective, how would you go about doing that if, you're a smart undergrad today trying to figure out the next intellectual steps?
Well, I would say two things. In a democratic republic, people may not believe it, but the people in the end do hold the whip hand, right? And so understanding how people think, in the country that you reside in, and in the kind of political system that you live in, and what are the dominant assumptions in the public or political culture of your place, is extremely important for practice, right? And that is an understanding that in principle cannot be summed up in a series of policy, policy specializations. It's something larger than that. It is the sea in which political analysis swims. That's point number one. Point number two, which is a principle that I strongly accept, and I suspect you do too, but others may not, is that in every public culture, there's an ensemble of goods and principles taken as worthy. The problem is that they don't always fit together comfortably. As a matter of fact, they may clash or compete. And so that effective public policy making involves an awareness of the clash of worthy goods and principles. And the need to be aware of that, even if you feel compelled by principle or by circumstances to give some of those principles pride of place over others. So let's take, let's take something, an issue where you and I think, have a modest disagreement, and that is the role of personal responsibility. Okay? And two things can be true at the same time. First of all, that people are born in more or less fortunate circumstances, and those circumstances shape their possibilities, their agency, the way they think, etc. And also that there is an element of agency or potential agency that all individuals have, and which must be respected and cultivated, and which should never be denied. To see people simply as the dependent variable of their circumstances is to deny them something extremely precious. And so to go to someone or a group in tough circumstances and say to them, you've been dealt a bad hand, but also you've played that bad hand badly, right? And we want to help, but we can't help you unless you want to help yourselves. Now, that strikes me as the kind of balance that is sustainable in a country like ours, that people are willing to help others if the others show signs of wanting to help themselves in cooperation with people who want to help them. So those were the sorts of more theoretical reflections that led me to support the Clinton welfare reform policy, which was at the time a matter of bitter debate. As you may recall, some members of the Clinton administration actually resigned in disagreement. I disagreed with that disagreement. I thought it struck a good balance. I thought that it would empower people who are being told that good things are possible and the state will help you achieve them. You'll get childcare and this and that. But you at least have to show up and make a plausible case that you are looking for employment. I didn't think there was anything immoral about that. I thought it was quite a moral policy, and it turned out to be quite a beneficial policy as well, in my judgment, but not only my judgment. So, that's a very practical example of how the theoretical high can interact with public policy. And I know you wrote a book taking a somewhat different view of the matter, but maybe less different in practice than in theory.
I think less different in practice than in theory, and this is really a deep cut. We're talking about political theory, and you generously invoked my PhD dissertation in political theory, and the book that is based on that PhD dissertation. My concern with the politics of personal responsibility, the rhetoric of personal responsibility, was perhaps too rooted in the arcane debates of political and moral philosophy. But the thing that exercised me actually was an attempt to apply to politics an overly abstract set of notions about what justice in the abstract would require. And so my real concern was to, the vision of a world that people like egalitarians advocated, in which, the great injustice in the world is that you might have something due to matters that are outside of your control that I don't have due to factors that are also outside of my control. And that vision, where equality really consists in equalizing the outcomes of what we call brute luck, then lends itself to a vision of a state as the human institution tasked with redressing the effects of brute luck. So really what the role of a state should be is that if you happen to be a little bit smarter than me, we need to make sure that you don't have a better life as a result of that. If you're a little bit more attractive than me, we have to make sure that your well-being is not somehow superior as a result. And I think that did bleed into at least the way that many political theorists thought about welfare state institutions, where the task of a bureaucrat became to inquire into your moral status, to figure out what your merits and demerits are, and then to make sure that the state, gave you your just deserts in exact arithmetic equivalence to whether you've made good or bad choices. And that always struck me as a very morally strange and hugely unrealistic way of going about the world. Now, what I don't have a problem with is various forms of conditionality for welfare state benefits, right? So to say that, the society is a scheme of social cooperation, and we want to have solidarity with those who are unfortunate, with those who are in dire straits for no particular fault of their own. But part of that is that, of course, we need to make access to those kind of things conditional, because that's the thing that both can encourage people to make good choices and that sustains our scheme of social cooperation over time, which ensures that welfare benefits, for example, don't become so prohibitively expensive that we're not going to be able to sustain them over time. That seems to me very sensible. Now, we might have to have a debate about the exact speeches that Bill Clinton gave or exact features of the Welfare Reform Act and on which side of the line it fell. But sort of a broader argument you're making that we should make sure that people have decent incentives in society, including incentives to enter the workforce in ways that will actually be beneficial to them, and that it is perfectly morally acceptable to make the receipt of various state benefits conditional on wanting to be an active participant in our broader social scheme of cooperation. I think that we would agree on.
But I think this little colloquy has illustrated how political theoretical considerations could come to bear on concrete public policy, and even more to the point that if there isn't someone in the mix of discussion in an administration who is prepared to view things in this light, there will be something missing from the deliberations that is actually quite important for them. So, that doesn't mean that political philosophers should be rulers, but it does mean that we have something to contribute to the policy debate without which it would be diminished. I genuinely believe that, and which is why I was amazed to find myself with a seat at the table. But I didn't think that someone with my background was, without capacity to add to the discussion, even though in many circumstances the discussion had to proceed, without much reference to it. I remember an interagency committee on the reform of pesticide laws, that I was assigned to chair. And at that point, theory had to give way to two things. First of all, the science of pesticides and the harms that they could inflict on human beings and other species, and on the other side, of course, the economic considerations about American agriculture, global food production, et cetera. How were those considerations to be balanced? What sort of abatement of the nuisance was consistent with a fair deal for farmers, et cetera, et cetera? That was an example where ordinary public policy analysis would take you a long way down the road. But, where policy analysis runs out is when balances must be struck among competing considerations, right? Unless you can believe that all of those considerations can be reduced to a single metric, which I do not, then at some point judgments, including, the sense of balance among competing interests, et cetera, has to enter in. And that may not be theoretical, but it's not scientific either.
Bill Galston, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.